Hello, and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security, engineering, and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Pramod Raghavendran, ex-Google, ex-Coinbase, currently enjoying a break before he starts his new adventure in the new year. And we'll be talking about privacy's intersection with other functions within your organization. Pramod, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Sean. Great to be back here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming back. You were last on the show, actually about a year ago, when we discussed operationalizing a privacy program. That's actually one of our most popular episodes that we've done, so it's great to have you back. Before we get into today's topic, what's kind of new in the last 12 months or so since I last spoke to you?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch that has changed. If you remember, since a year ago was around when ChatGPT launched.
Yeah.
And that's kind of created a hockey stick kind of a growth for AI, especially generative AI. And every enterprise, every business wants to associate themselves with AI, leverage AI as best as they can. And I think that's created some very interesting edges from a privacy standpoint, some very interesting considerations about how data should be processed and managed. And on the personal side, in this last year, I've become a dad for the first time. And as I was getting through paperwork for our little one, I peeked inside some of the processes, some of the photo requirements for passports, and then there are so many third-party tools out there that promise to give you passport-sized photos processed. And just looking at privacy notices about what they do with the pictures, there's a lot of scary stuff out there. So it was just exposed me to a new edge of privacy there. And then every little thing that I bought for the nursery comes with this card, which has kind of your registration details, and then has an open form where you can put in your name, address, phone number, and send it back by post for warranty and that sort of stuff. And that stuff is open. Anybody can read it along the supply chain of your letter, making it from your home to the actual vendor. So it was interesting. While I've enjoyed fatherhood, it has also exposed me to the privacy aspect of children's data along the way as well.
Well, first of all, big congratulations.
Thank you.
Becoming a father, that's amazing. And then do you think as a privacy professional, spending your career in privacy, maybe you know too much? It's just like, there's a little bit of like ignorance is bliss when it comes to some of this stuff. Because it is really scary as you start to know more and more. You really start to kind of like notice these little things. Well, maybe they're not even little things, but, where everybody's kind of asking you for information. And you start to question like, why do they really need that information? And how are they storing this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think knowing the behind the scenes of how data is processed and how data is used makes it really hard to consume services. I always second guess myself. I'm always worried about what's happening. But, well, I guess it's good because I'm learning a lot from that. And in my roles, I've always had the opportunity to create an impact for a broader set of customers who perhaps don't know enough about these sorts of things. So I take that more as healthy friction that I'm introducing for myself, so I can help a lot of other people better.
Yeah, you got to live it so that you can learn how to help. You mentioned ChatGPT. They just had their anniversary. It's been about a year. Of course, everyone's especially the last 6 months. I feel like every conversation is talking about AI and LLMs. How is that impacting and changing what's sort of top of mind for privacy engineers right now?
Yeah, I think there's two perspectives to that I want to bring, right? One is, if you really think about data process for AI, it's kind of the fundamentals are no different to any other data processing pipelines. You've got data that's being consumed, it's being used for certain purposes, it has a life cycle. The life cycles are very different in AI, but then ultimately, some of those primitives are the same in the sense, are you using personal data? Are you not using personal data? If you're using personal data, what are you using it for? Are the outputs aggregate or are they personal in nature? So some of those questions remain constant. Yet, what AI has introduced is a set of new challenges that you've got to worry about. And bias is a very, very important consideration when it comes to privacy. So bias comes in many different forms, hallucinations, etc. And if you really think about those AI diseases, if you will, the medicines for those are not even in trials yet. That's how nascent some of those technologies, those problems are. But the adoption of these technologies on the AI side is so rapid that there's a huge gap in between adoption and having protections and ability to deal with data in the AI space. So I think that's what's top of mind from privacy practitioner's perspective, as a leader, I always worry about the risks that we're introducing, especially the long-term risks that we're introducing with AI that we perhaps don't even comprehend today. For example, when personal data makes it into a model, it's super hard, or perhaps today there's no known way of actually getting it out of a model, right? And unless you retrain all up from scratch. So what are enterprises doing today that perhaps is irreversible, that perhaps may not show up as risk until a few months down the line? This, I think, is what a lot of leaders are going to be worried about. This is what they're going to be thinking about. On the one side, you want to be an enabler and enable the use of AI, the adoption of AI, while being careful about some of the risks, both short-term and long-term, being introduced.
Yeah, I mean, even in this last week, there was a story that came out about, I think researchers at Google were able to manipulate ChatGPT through prompts to actually pull out like PII. And you think of all the expertise and sort of like level of scrutiny that OpenAI is under, and how much resources they're putting into trying to really lock down their system, and they're still having a hard time doing it. So I think for anybody out there that's thinking about investments in this space, like they have to be considering how good are they at actually being able to protect customer data fully through the life cycle of LLM, when basically the people who are like the leaders at the forefront of AI are still struggling to do that.
Absolutely. And I think the most jarring thing is, imagine explaining that risk to a business person who wants to launch AI and kick a goal to say, hey, I've adopted AI, right? That's the tension that we are faced with in terms of how privacy is going to adapt itself and ramp up to ramp the business up in terms of knowing what some of the risk edges are overall.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm sure we'll probably dip in and out of AI as we talk, such as the nature of any conversation in technology today. But sort of transferring to the topic at hand regarding essentially privacy's intersection with other functions, I think like one of the places where privacy sort of intersects with other functions predominantly, especially as people who are maybe don't know a lot about privacy, is with regards to security. A lot of times people lump these functions together, but they're actually quite different. Certainly security plays a role, but there's parts of privacy that have nothing to do with security. So how are maybe culturally and also technically privacy engineers different than security engineers?
Yeah, I think this is a question that a lot of people have on their minds. So I want to take a moment to define what a privacy engineer is, right? It's a very emerging term, so I think there's a lot of confusion there too. Privacy engineers are on a spectrum. On the one side of the spectrum is an engineer who basically is able to look at a product, a feature, a piece of code, a piece of software, assess it for privacy risks, and provide advisory and guidance in terms of what's the right way to build that feature or implement that feature. So I call that the advisory end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got a software engineer who's building privacy solutions, like building privacy primitives, building pseudonymization frameworks, building encryption frameworks, building consent management platforms, etc., that are also called privacy engineers. Traditionally, though, security engineers have sat on the advisory end of that spectrum. So for the purposes of this discussion, we'll consider the privacy engineers on the advisory side of the spectrum, which might make a more apples-to-apples kind of a comparison. Before getting into the differences, I think there are two broad similarities that we should leverage and always keep in the back of our minds. Both these types of engineers should have an adversarial mindset. They have to look at how can things be broken to be able to do their jobs well. And the second is they both have protection or trust as their primary goal in mind. So these two things are common things that you should look to leverage, look to build around in terms of setting up your privacy engineering and security engineering capabilities. But it doesn't stop there. There are lots of differences. If you think about it first, there's a regulatory dimension. Privacy is a lot more regulated than security is. And I say a lot more because there are some regulatory compliance considerations like SOX and SOC that you will find in the security side, but nothing as comprehensive as the GDPR or the CCPA or the CPRA that exists in the privacy space. Being regulated, privacy has some very different considerations than security itself. That bleeds itself into the kind of personas that each of these engineers look to solve for. if you take a security engineer, the persona perhaps they're solving for is an adversarial outsider and an adversarial insider. On the privacy side, apart from the adversarial outsider and insider, you have a regulator. You have an average customer who has rights that you have to provide and support. You have the press advocate who's going to look at your privacy features and perhaps write articles about that. So you've got a variety of different personas to think on behalf of to solve for privacy considerations. So there's a big difference. And I think security teams have still not gotten to that level to kind of understand some of these other edges. Finally, if you really think about it, security focuses a lot on the control plane in your architecture, right? It's about controlling right from the nuts and bolts to the data in transit and the data at rest. Whereas privacy goes a step further than that to look at the data plane, which is what's the schema of the data, who's using that data, what is it being used for, is the extra length that privacy needs to go to. Fundamentally, privacy sits at the intersection of data type and data use, whereas security focuses a lot on the data type, little less on the data use perspective. So I think these are some of the fundamental differences that you would see between security engineers and privacy engineers. And you should take that into consideration as you set up these features. The best way to think about it is there's a Venn diagram between those two, right? Privacy requires security, and security requires privacy as well. That's kind of where things are.
And then you mentioned essentially this kind of two parts of data: the data type and the data use. What's an example of data type?
Yeah, so let's take email as an example, right? If you take a financial institution, an email is required for KYC purposes, know your customer purposes. But the same email is also used for marketing purposes. Now, when you think about it from a security perspective, what you're doing is you're protecting an email, right? You classify an email as a particular classification, let's say confidential, highly confidential, whatever your internal taxonomy is. And associated with that, you have some handling considerations: encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit, least privilege access, etc. But when you come to the privacy side of things, the email used for KYC and the email used for marketing are C's apart, right? If you think about your KYC, perhaps you can use contract performance as your justification under regulations to process it. For marketing, perhaps you need consent, very different. How long can you use data for? For KYC, perhaps you can use it for as long as the account is active and maybe for many years after for regulatory compliance purposes. Whereas for marketing, there's a use by date by which you can use that information before you seek consent again. So very different handling considerations. A simple example, but hopefully accentuates what that differences could be.
Yeah, another example of it happened in the last years with, at least I think it was the last year, was with Twitter. They had phone numbers that they were using for 2FA, and then they started actually marketing to them as well,
Yes.
which was fine from a security perspective, but is not fine from a privacy perspective. The same idea that you're talking about with the email there. And I think that's one of the challenges that companies have is sometimes, understanding what was the original sort of, rules of engagement with the collection of that information, right? If you're just a marketing person and you see like, hey, we have all these phone numbers we're not using, and you might not, think like, oh, I need to figure out what was the consent involved or what was the sort of rules of engagement or promise that we gave our customer when we collected that phone number, what was the original use for it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's notice and disclosure, the choice mechanisms that you provide to your customers, what that legal justification is for you to process that information, data minimization, and how you're going to retain that data. These are considerations that perhaps are incremental on top of what security would consider when they assess handling of data.
Mm-hmm. So how do these organizations, privacy and security, and maybe privacy with other functions, how do they typically work together and collaborate? Yeah,
there are many different ways that organizations set up these two teams, and I've seen them across my last 3 or 4 jobs. I've seen that be very varied as well. So here's an example, right? Security is fairly mature body of knowledge as an organization as well, and typically you tend to have dedicated security organizations. Privacy being still in its infancy, nascency, There are still models being worked out in terms of how best to operate there. I've seen privacy teams sit close to the the product and the engineering functions. I've seen privacy roll into the CISO organization, very close to security. I've also seen privacy sit within the legal function. So really depending on where privacy sits, I think how the two teams interact has been very, very different. Apart from talking about how they're different, how they're leveraged, I think if there was an ideal way of operating, the way I would think about it is abstracting some of the fundamentals. If you really think about it, security cares about observability of data. They observe it to achieve security outcomes. Privacy needs to observe data as well to achieve outcomes there, right? And then ultimately, on top of the observability, you've got policies and a set of risks that could eventuate. Similarly, on the privacy side, you've got that commonality. And then on top of that, essentially what each of us as leaders need inside organizations is actionability. What can you do with all of that data that you build? So if you start to model your organization around that framework that I mentioned, some of your core technology sits at the bottom, where you can talk about things like IAM, your asset management, your data inventory, your core frameworks like tokenization, pseudonymization, etc., can sit in that common engineering tier at the bottom as a core. And then on top of that, you can build specialized security functions that sit on top of it, specialized privacy functions that sit on top of that, and then drive some of your policies and outcomes overall. That's ideally how I would set up engagements if I had the opportunity to start clean slate.
Okay. And in terms of where privacy sits, like what the reporting structure is, does that also determine where it fits in that spectrum that you're talking about? Like if it's in the legal department, is that perhaps are you going to be focused probably more on the advisory role versus if it's in product and engineering, they're probably, I would assume, leaning into more of the engineering aspect of privacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. But having said that, I've seen privacy teams sit inside legal. I'm seeing less and less of that happen these days. I think there's a recognition that privacy needs to be closer to product and engineering, and that's where a lot of organizations are putting their privacy teams. There are some organizations that continue to keep that within the security organization. There are pros and cons to both of those, and I think both of them are models that evolve and work out.
And then how does the privacy organization, and perhaps in collaboration with the security team or maybe with product and engineering, actually ensure the protection of sensitive data and information, and that they are following essentially the whatever the regulations are for the type of information that they're collecting?
Yeah, I think the important thing is to look at risk dimensions that each of the teams own, right? The security teams and the privacy teams. If you look at the security teams, DLP is a huge consideration. Data loss prevention, both internally and externally. Some of the primitives used to protect against that is classification of data and then managing access controls. Privacy leverages that as well. In terms of access controls, we need to know who has access to data and what are they using it for. So there's a fundamental there. So I think it's coming up with common roadmaps to see how tools can be leveraged uniformly across the board while addressing each of the risk surfaces. So as an example, I think there's understanding the entire catalog of data that you're processing. Security folks would call it your crown jewels within it. In privacy parlance, yes, you do have your crown jewels in terms of what's most important from a business standpoint, but then you also have what's sensitive from a privacy standpoint. Your biometric data, your location data, your health data, these are really, really sensitive stuff that you need to be absolutely careful about. So understanding where your data is, understanding how that data is being processed, by whom and where it's flowing is going to be super important. So those are some of the common problems that you would look to solve for, that observability tier that I just talked about. And then beyond that, it's about partnerships with the teams. I think at the layer of mechanisms, when you talk about an engineering team and saying, hey, I have a new feature to launch, I need to get a privacy review, I need to get a security review. Do I need to get two separate reviews? Can I go to one spot and get two reviews done behind the scenes? These are some of the organizational considerations that need to be thought through, and how privacy sits within an organization will determine some of that. If it's inside a CISO org, chances are I could just create one request to say, hey, I need a review done for this particular feature. Behind the scenes, you get security, you get privacy, whoever else that you need to get involved, review that, provide some guidance, and then you kind of streamline things. But if you've got very differently situated teams, then perhaps two separate reviews to look at each of the individual considerations. But ultimately, it is leveraging the tooling layer, which is your infrastructure layer in terms of some of the primitives, using the mechanisms layer in terms of how you can interact at the mechanisms layer, and then ultimately the people layer as well. Making sure that from a training standpoint, from an engagement standpoint, you also have partnerships with the people that you work with so that privacy and security can be in lockstep as they make progress on things.
And then in terms of like decisions around software investments, like maybe even what database or warehouse solution you're going to use, would privacy engineering be contributing to that mostly from guidance about how they should actually be safely using those tools and how they should be storing the information and using the information, or are they actually involved with the decision-making process of which tools are actually purchased?
Privacy does get involved in terms of which tools are purchased because there are risk surfaces you got to think about, right? Ultimately, when you have third-party tools coming in, the data processing agreements that you need to have, you have to establish the roles that each of the parties play, right? The organization you work for and the third-party controllers, processors, who controls what, who processes what. So definitely privacy gets involved in those sorts of things. I think privacy would care less about the technology choice itself, more about some of these privacy dimension-based considerations. Security cares a lot more about some of the fundamentals, right? Is it a SaaS-based solution that you're using? Is it going to be within our DMZ? Then who has access to it from the vendor side? So those sorts of considerations we would delegate from a privacy standpoint to the security function to evaluate and leverage. But ultimately, I think privacy has an opportunity to influence the type of solutions that are being sought after, right? As an example, if you think about it, thinking about privacy by design, you need to build privacy within frameworks. What is a framework? You talk about tokenization. You talk about building a privacy vault as an example, right? That's a fundamental framework piece that has an enormous impact on your ability to handle privacy obligations across the globe. So if privacy teams can influence choices of those sorts of technologies, then I think that's the right maturity for an organization to be at, where you can actually influence the change in the compliance rather than just being a reactive team taking assessments and providing guidance.
Yeah. So in that case, the privacy leadership or the privacy engineering function would be guiding hopefully the product and engineering organization around either thinking implementing things from a privacy by design standpoint, or investing in sort of these technologies on the forefront that people in the privacy engineering space are well versed and know about, but maybe someone from a traditional software engineering background doesn't know about.
Yeah, and if you really think about privacy engineering teams today, the number one risk that these functions face is they're being perceived as blockers. Right. Or that engineering teams are paying a tax to talk to the privacy team because we are putting extra requirements on each of their features before they launch. Unfortunately, that is true because of some of the obligations that enterprises have from a privacy standpoint. And if you start thinking about managing privacy and compliance on a per feature basis, it's definitely going to seem like overhead. So if you take a step back and look at this holistically, there are much more elegant ways of solving problems that would require some upfront investment, but it'll pay for itself very, very quickly. Right? Today, enterprises' number one problem is data sprawl. And within that data sprawl, personal data sprawl, there's so many applications. The surface area of where personal data is available and accessible within enterprises is so significantly huge that your compliance burden is that much big as well. If you aim to reduce that sprawl by localizing your personal data into a small, well-protected area, then you start to manage some of your compliance costs overall in terms of how you run your compliance processes, right? And then building some of the fundamentals like data retention, data deletion, data access into your framework pieces also helps you get some of that for free as you launch new features. So these are some of the primitives that I think privacy engineering should look to influence. And again, there's a philosophical discussion about a build versus a buy. Where do you buy versus where you build? So these are places where I'd like to see privacy teams be more proactive and have a seat at the table to have these conversations rather than just take things reactively.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like if you, especially in the early part of building a company, if you're sort of optimizing for speed in the early days, you might take on a lot of like technical debt essentially.
Yes.
In the privacy world, that leads to this huge like PII sprawl problem that at some point becomes just like a cost center for you to do anything, both in terms of time management and also puts your business further at risk. It's kind of like, you can move faster by building a complete monolith infrastructure to begin with, but at some point there's going to be a cost associated with that because it's going to slow down your dev cycles because everyone's sort of building on the same code base, and your build cycles and deployment cycles really start to slow down. So at some point you got to break that thing up. And I think in the privacy world, it's like you need to consolidate and minimize the footprint.
Yes, this is the classic short-term gain for long-term pain problem that you really have. It's a legitimate approach to take, especially when you have time to market considerations when you launch products, features. But you've got to recognize that it's a trade-off with the total cost of ownership. Over a period of time, your total cost is going to increase if you don't reinvest in your tech debt to kind of burn that down.
And then, are there best practices or lessons that you've learned from your experience in terms of fostering collaboration between the privacy function of the department, and also not avoiding essentially this situation that privacy departments can get into where it feels like there's like friction between them and the product engineering organization?
Yeah, I think from being considered blockers or the office of no, I think that's kind of the top problem, and addressing that early is very, very important. What I've figured is building a culture around privacy is super important. There are many ways to do that. You could define a set of privacy principles, start to showcase that across the organization. Privacy trainings are have a lot to do with building that muscle up across the organization. I've seen a lot of trainings be kind of self-service. Go to your favorite training portal within the organization, click next, a few slides, and then a few questions and answers, and done. But that's less effective than actually having face-to-face. Getting cohorts of people into a room and having a very engaging and interactive learning session about privacy, I've seen has worked wonders in terms of not only educating people about privacy, but also making sure that they can start taking ownership for privacy. Privacy is not owned by the team that sits in the corner. It's owned by everybody in the organization. And I think building that muscle is super important to make sure that the office of no or the blocker team perspective is actually gone. The second, I think, is getting people to shift left. Typically, as organizations that are not as mature from a privacy standpoint start to operate a privacy function, things are absolutely to the right. Before I launch something, I'm going to reach out to a privacy lawyer and the new privacy team and say, hey, can I launch this? And at that time, you're basically left with zero options, right? You say, yes, launch, everything is good, or yes, launch, you've got these risks that you have to remediate later. Ultimately, those are kind of the first options that you have. But shifting left from there and coming into the earlier stages of the conversation, in fact, right at the early stage of inception of an idea is where I'd want to take privacy teams, right? Once you start doing that, I think it becomes a lot easier for privacy teams to engage with the other teams. And it's not just product and engineering teams. If you think about privacy itself, your HR teams, they use a lot of vendor products. They deal with a lot of employee data. If you look at Google Docs and spreadsheets, that's perhaps the place where most employee data lives in a lot of organizations. That's huge privacy risk as well. You talk about marketing teams, they deal with a lot of sensitive data. So finance teams as well. They have their own sets of data that you have to worry about too. So I think it's more than just product and engineering. It's about taking privacy to all of these cross-functional partners within an organization, elevating the profile of privacy and making sure you're able to support them through the mechanisms that you create for them. And I think the most important thing is privacy is a shared responsibility. It cannot be owned by the team that sits in the corner that is called the privacy team. So anything that you can do to make sure everybody in the organization starts to take a little bit of ownership, while the specialist privacy team is there to assist them and help them, that's the ideal state to kind of work your way towards.
Yeah, at the beginning there, you were talking about the idea of just having a meeting, like essentially instead of doing these like self-guided like education where everyone's just like clicking the next button while checking their email as quickly as possible, bringing that into an in-person thing. But I think we tend to underestimate the value of just like simply face-to-face where and like building relationships. And that's such a high value thing, not just from the education part, but essentially making, in this case, the privacy function feel like these are real people, and I know who they are, and now I can talk to them, and you understand, what are they, like, what are they serving, or their responsibility within the business? How can I leverage them, and so forth, is going to fix, I think, a lot of this, tendency of thinking them as the office of no and being a source of friction.
Yep.
So we talked a little bit at the beginning about AI and how essentially every company right now is becoming an AI company. And there's a lot of challenges in the world of AI, even though we're all excited about it in terms of security, privacy, compliance, governance. So are you seeing privacy teams jump in and take an active role in the AI and what's happening in terms of AI innovation right now?
Yeah, I had my team jump on it straight away. I think a lot of other teams are as well, because thanks to a lot of the activity around the privacy fraternity as well, right? If you think about it, IAPP has done a good job of coming up with an AI governance framework. There's a lot of training material out there for AI governance that has started to come up as well. There's lots of podcasts, webinars, etc. happening about this that kind of is highlighting that this is an important aspect. So I think all of that is good. Although while you think about operationalizing some of that into the organization, I think there are a couple of different ways that you could go. Again, you could create AI governance as a function of its own and start to create a parallel stream of tools, mechanisms, lots of those things. Or you can take AI for all of its commonalities and start to integrate AI governance into your security governance, into your existing privacy governance, into your compliance functions, where they're already existing, but you get guidance on AI as well. My preference is for that latter approach. If you really think about it, AI is just a different use case. As an example, when biometric data began being used widely, we did not create a biometric governance model. When location data started to become available, we did not create a geolocation governance model. What we did was we enhanced our existing security governance, our privacy governance mechanisms to deal with the specificities of geolocation data, biometric data, or other such sensitive categories of data. I'd like to see that happen more with AI in terms of, yes, the body of knowledge is good. It has to exist. It has to create that awareness. It is a good vehicle to kind of train and grow skills in that AI space. But as you operationalize things, I'd like to see that fold into existing mechanisms. Think about a product or an engineering persona, right? If I'm wearing a product manager's hat, and if I suddenly have a security review to do, a privacy review to do, and an AI review to do, it's just adding to it. Where are we going to stop, right? You've got to think about that user experience there and streamline things for them. For the uninitiated or the uninformed product owner, they should say, I'm building this feature. Here are the facts about this feature. I need some guidance. Tell me what it is that I need to do. If it's an AI feature, fantastic. I need to know about bias. I need to know about hallucination. I need to know about how to handle deletion. If it's not about AI, fantastic. Those considerations are not there. There are other considerations that we can help you with. So I think there's some pragmatism to be applied in terms of operationalizing AI functions. The good thing, though, is I am seeing a lot of traction in that organizations are looking at AI from a privacy standpoint. Just the how is something that's going to evolve over a period of time.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point in terms of the potential burden if we introduce yet another, essentially, sequence that you have to run through in order to launch a product, especially where I think we're going to get to a place like right now, AI is like the new thing that feels very novel. But once the hype, settles down and we go through the trough of disillusionment and the real work starts, like in 5 years or maybe 10 years, essentially AI will just be a component of probably every piece of software.
That's
like
right.
software is going to become more adaptive. It's going to become more personal. So you're not going to be thinking about it as AI as a feature. It's just essentially the way things get built. And at that point, you definitely don't want some kind of like specialized like checklist that you need to run through just for whatever the AI piece is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you really look under the lens, right, we have been living with AI for over a decade now. AI has been part of our lives already. Enterprises have already been processing data through machine learning, through other AI techniques. It's only generative AI that perhaps has come up in the last 12 months that introduces some interesting problems, but the proof is in that pudding. We've done AI for 10 years. We've not had to have a dedicated AI governance program. What is it that we have now that requires it, right? So I think that's some thinking to be had there, and perhaps organizations will evolve over a period of time. I think it's still that approach you mentioned earlier. Early on in the company, you tend to get things done as fast as you can, and then over a period of time, you pay off some of that debt. In this instance, it's the process debt that you're going to pay off over a period of time as you think about how you organize yourselves.
What are your thoughts on some of the like AI regulations that are starting to be developed? Or do you think that we need new types of regulations, though, given essentially the I don't know, the new frontier around generative AI?
I think this is a very nascent topic. I think there's a lot more to be had in terms of a debate there. I think from a regulation standpoint, yes, there should be some regulation is my view on it. Because ultimately, anywhere that harm can be done, regulation has been the way we have solved for it. You look at you look at the financial industry. You've got heavily regulated financial industries, at least in the U.S. Less so externally. You look at crypto, not largely regulated yet in the US, but there's emerging push towards regulation in that space. Again, it's because of the risks that the technology brings. Similarly, with AI, there's a lot of good to gain from it, but there's a lot of bad that could happen as well. And I think ultimately, some sort of regulation is going to be required. Where it gets tricky and complex is what is that regulation? Who should be regulating, and how should that regulation happen is where perhaps a lot of the debate should be had in the next few months.
Yeah, still lots to figure out. Everything's moving quickly, so it's probably going to take a while before people fully understand, or maybe they'll never. But essentially, any progress is progress. So.
Yeah, I think we're also going through another kind of an evolution where typically you tend to build rules, regulations, etc., based on a set of assumptions. In the AI space, you're seeing those assumptions being broken very, very rapidly. An assumption that is true in month 1 is perhaps broken in month 3 because of some of the advancements that have happened. Right? The rapid pace of change of innovation is going to be something to consider as well, and that's why perhaps regulation needs to contemplate what AI can do in the future and start thinking about that now, building some of the foundational blocks rather than just being reactive and solving for what AI can do today. Because if we do that, it's going to be obsolete very, very quickly.
So, looking ahead, even outside of AI and sort of more to the core of what we've been discussing around the relationship between privacy and other functional areas, what trends or developments do you anticipate in the future as I think more organizations invest in privacy engineering teams and people have just a better understanding of what they should be doing from a privacy perspective?
We've talked about privacy and security a lot. but there are other functions within organizations like data governance and compliance functions that also sit and have a significant overlap with what privacy teams do. Right? They're all a Venn diagram. They all have their unique things that they solve for, but there's a common part that kind of applies across the board as well. Right? If you take these four as an example, compliance, security, governance, and privacy, today typically very kind of decentralized. Each of these are a team of their own. They go off and solve for things themselves. I think where organizations will move towards in the next year or so is thinking about how to consolidate some of these streams into a combination of a common area of centralization with a little bit of decentralization, right? And that mix and finding the right balance within your organization for how you can optimize how you your investments in these areas is going to be an important challenge that organizations have to solve in order to be able to scale their overall compliance, their overall customer trust narratives. The way to do that is through the lens of technology, in my mind, right? If you think about how you're going to achieve all of these outcomes, security, privacy, compliance, governance, trust, any of these outcomes is through technology. And what lays in that technology layer is a lot of primitives that you can piece together to achieve outcomes. So how can you abstract at that layer and say, let me build a common team that solves for data protection or customer protection or trust engineering, if you will, right? Call it trust engineering, build out all of your primitives there, and on top of that, have your decentralized privacy org that leverages your tools, your security org that leverages tools, your governance org, your compliance org leverages tools, stitches them together to start to provide outcomes that are specific to their primary charters. So I think moving towards that paradigm is perhaps where organizations will start to focus some energy on. If they're not, they should, because the number of such considerations that are starting to come in are just going to be rapidly growing, that if you don't streamline your investments, the cost of managing your trust is going to rapidly increase.
And then as we start to wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything that's you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I think I'll leave with one passing thought, right? Ultimately, even within an organization, there are internal customers that the privacy teams are servicing. These customers are from product, from engineering, from marketing, from HR, from payroll, from all of these teams that process personal data. As you think about the investments that you make, the technology that you buy or build, the tools that you build, the mechanisms that you set up, the guidance that you provide, always keep that customer at the back of their mind, right? Think about simplifying it from their perspective without abstracting it so much that they do not have any ownership over privacy itself, right? Finding that balance where you streamline it, make things easy for them, while also making sure that your partner teams, your customers recognize the ownership they have on privacy overall is that important balance to strike, especially as you work with your cross-functional teams.
I think it's a great place to leave it. Great advice. Thank you so much for coming back, and have a great holiday and enjoy your little break before your next adventure. And we'll have to do this again, maybe before we won't wait 12 months next time. So.
Sounds good. Absolutely. Happy to be back and enjoyed this chat as well. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks so much. Cheers.